Welcome to the deadly obsession, where family secrets turn dark. I know you're eager to find out what happened, but before we begin, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss our next story. And let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. Now, let's get into the mystery. What if your family's deepest secrets led to unimaginable tragedy? What if the perfect life you knew was just a mask hiding a dark obsession? She had everything: a loving family, a beautiful home, a life others only dreamed of. But beneath that perfect surface lay a story no one could ever imagine. This is the story of a family held together by love yet torn apart by secrets, a family that never saw the darkness closing in until it was too late. At first, it was just a feeling, something she couldn't quite place. A chill in the air, a slight unease that lingered longer than it should. She shrugged it off, telling herself it was nothing, until it wasn't. Imagine living in a world where your family was everything to you, your rock, your safe place. But then, piece by piece, that world starts to shift, slowly at first, like a shadow crossing the sun. You tell yourself it's all in your head, that life is just taking its course. But then the strange occurrences begin, whispers you can't quite make out, footsteps in the hallways when everyone is supposed to be asleep, a lingering gaze that feels too close, too intense. And with each passing day, that feeling grows, wrapping itself around your life like a fog you can't escape. This family had no enemies, no history of secrets. They were beloved in their community, known for their kindness, their unity. But all it took was one moment, one glance, one obsession, for everything to unravel. They say there's no place safer than home, but for them, home became a prison. It became a place of fear. And so, we ask you, if the ones you trusted most could keep secrets this dark, would you ever truly feel safe again? Or would you find yourself looking over your shoulder, wondering what might be lurking just beyond the light? In the secluded town of Riverbend, surrounded by thick pine woods and misty valleys, the Mason family was seen as the kind of people others looked up to. Their house stood proudly on the edge of town, its windows gleaming warmly under the morning sun, as if to promise that everything inside was as perfect as it appeared. People in town loved the Masons, admired them, even envied them. To those on the outside, John and Helen Mason, with their 2 children, seemed to have built a life out of pure happiness. But beneath those smiles and the laughter that filled their home, there were whispers, murmurs of things unsaid, secrets buried so deeply that even they may have forgotten the darkness within their own walls. John Mason was the man everyone in town trusted. A dedicated doctor, he ran the local clinic with steady hands and a warm smile, tending to his patients like family. He was the type of man who remembered every birthday, who never hesitated to make a house call if someone needed help. Patients spoke of his kindness, how his presence could calm even the most anxious of souls. But there was another side to John Mason, a side that remained hidden behind his polished exterior. John's long hours at the clinic kept him away more often than he liked. The people in town assumed it was his devotion to his work, his need to care for others. But for John, it was more than that. Those long hours were an escape, a way to avoid coming home, to avoid facing the silence that seemed to grow louder in his absence. And then there was Helen, his wife. She was the kind of woman people relied on, the one who organized the church fundraisers, who knew every child in town by name, who always had a listening ear for anyone in need. To the people of Riverbend, Helen Mason was an anchor, a woman with a heart so open it seemed impossible for her to have any secrets. But Helen had her own story, a life she'd lived before Riverbend, before John, before this perfect house on the hill. It was a life she rarely spoke of, a past that seemed almost like a ghost she'd left behind. Or at least, that's what she had believed. Because Helen Mason carried secrets that even her own family didn't know. Their eldest, Eric Mason, was a puzzle in himself. At 18, Eric was the kind of young man who seemed destined for greatness. Handsome, confident, and with a sharp mind, he was a natural leader among his peers. But there was a restlessness to him, a fire that burned too bright, too wild. His parents tried to guide him, to to channel that energy, but Eric was a free spirit, drawn to the edges of things, to the places his parents dared not look. And as much as his parents loved him, Eric had begun to pull away, creating a distance that they couldn't cross. He came and went with an air of mystery, keeping his plans and his friends a secret. He was drifting into a world they knew nothing about, a world where rules didn't apply, where risk was the only thing that made him feel alive. Then there was Abby Mason, the youngest, just 10 years old. With her wide, innocent eyes and her unending curiosity, she was adored by her family, and cherished as the light of their home. Abby was the glue that held them together, the one who could always bring a smile to their faces. But Abby wasn't as innocent as she seemed. Beneath that childlike wonder was a sharp mind, a mind that observed more than it should, that listened when others thought they were alone. She had heard things, small fragments of conversations, whispers behind closed doors. Abby's young mind couldn't piece it all together, but she knew something was wrong. And with every passing day, her innocent curiosity was leading her closer to the secrets her family had worked so hard to keep. And so, in that quiet house on the hill, the Masons went on with their lives, each holding their secrets close, each hoping that the others would never see the cracks that had begun to form. John continued his late nights at the clinic, Helen kept her past locked away, Eric drifted further into his world of thrill and rebellion, and Abby watched it all, silent and unnoticed. On the outside, they were still the perfect family. But on the inside, they were each hiding something, each holding a piece of a puzzle they couldn't see. And like pieces of glass slowly shifting, these secrets would soon collide, shattering the facade they'd spent so long building. Because while they may have believed they were safe, the Masons didn't know that their secrets were not only theirs to keep. Someone was watching, someone who knew more about them than they knew about each other. And this someone had an obsession. An obsession that would tear them apart in ways they could never have imagined. The Masons carried on with their lives, each holding on to secrets they dared not share. But they weren't the only ones who knew the details of their lives. Unbeknownst to them, someone else was watching, paying close attention to their every move. It began as something subtle, a feeling, a shadow passing by the window, a figure standing too long at the corner of the street. Helen dismissed it at first, thinking it was her imagination. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. And it wasn't long before that feeling started to take form, lurking just beyond the light, always there, watching. At first, it was only Helen who noticed, but soon Eric began to feel it too. A strange sensation, like someone was following him. He'd glance over his shoulder, catching a glimpse of movement, a figure slipping away just out of sight. He convinced himself it was nothing, that maybe he was just being paranoid. But it didn't take long for that unease to turn into fear. Then came the phone calls, silent, breathless calls at odd hours, just long enough for Helen to answer before the line went dead. She started locking the doors and closing the curtains, but the feeling never left her. And then there were the letters, unsigned, left on their doorstep. They weren't threatening, just personal. Too personal. John, however, was dismissive. He told her it was likely some prank, maybe even Eric's doing, and not something to worry about. But as time went on, Helen couldn't ignore the growing feeling of unease. She began to suspect that perhaps this mysterious presence had something to do with her past, a past she thought she'd buried long ago. But Helen wasn't the only one keeping secrets. John himself had been more absent than usual, staying late at work, claiming that the demands of his job were growing. But there were rumors, whispers that maybe John's reasons for staying late had little to do with work. Whispers that someone else in town might know more about John's late nights than he let on. But these suspicions were nothing compared to what would happen next. One night, Eric didn't come home. The hours stretched on, and as dawn broke, Helen's worry grew into panic. She called his friends, and checked the places he frequented, but no one had seen him. That night, as the sun rose and Eric's bed remained empty, the family's worst fears came true. Days passed without a word from Eric. John tried to reassure Helen, telling her that Eric was just going through a phase and that he would come back when he was ready. But Helen wasn't convinced. She knew her son better than anyone, and she knew he wouldn't just disappear. Not without reason. Then, out of nowhere, more letters arrived, this time with details that only someone close to the family would know. The letters spoke of Eric, mentioning places he frequented, and people he spent time with. It was as if someone had been shadowing him, tracking his every move. The messages grew more disturbing, more intimate, until Helen began to realize that whoever was watching her family knew them in ways that made her blood run cold. Helen felt her world closing in, and John's dismissive attitude only added to her growing sense of isolation. He remained distant, almost irritated by her fears, insisting that she was overreacting. But when John found a photograph on his car one evening, an old picture of Helen with a man she thought she'd left behind, he began to realize that there was something he hadn't been told, something hidden in Helen's past that was coming back to haunt them. As the days stretched on, the mystery of Eric's disappearance became the talk of Riverbend. Rumors began to spread, theories about where he could have gone, who he might be with. Some people suggested that Eric had simply run away, but others whispered of darker possibilities, that perhaps someone else had taken an interest in him, someone whose obsession with the Masons was deeper than anyone could imagine. The letters continued, each one revealing more personal details about the Masons, details that no one outside the family should have known. It became clear that the person behind the letters had been watching them closely, learning their habits, their fears, their weaknesses. And with each passing day, the Masons felt the walls closing in, their once perfect life slipping through their fingers, as the stalker's obsession grew ever darker. What began as small disturbances had now become a waking nightmare, and the family could feel the weight of something inevitable drawing closer, something they couldn't escape. The Masons were no strangers to hardship. Their perfect lives were the result of years of sacrifice, carefully crafted routines, and unspoken agreements to keep certain secrets buried. Yet, beneath the surface, each of them carried their own private burdens, burdens that had shaped them, haunted them, and, in the end, drew them together into the tangled web of fear they now faced. Helen had always been a mystery, even to those closest to her. On the outside, she was a devoted mother, a caring wife, a woman with an endless supply of patience and kindness. But Helen was not from Riverbend. She came from another town, miles away, a place where her past remained buried, or so she'd thought. There was a time when Helen had been a different person, a time when she'd loved recklessly, throwing caution to the wind. But that love had turned sour. The man from her past had grown controlling and possessive. He didn't just love her, he wanted to own her, to possess her. When she finally broke free, she thought she'd left him behind for good. But perhaps she'd underestimated his obsession, his unwillingness to let go. Because now, nearly 2 decades later, she could feel his presence again, lingering like a shadow. She didn't know if he'd truly returned or if the past was simply playing tricks on her mind, but she knew that every instinct within her was screaming that he was near. Then there was John. The Masons had moved to Riverbend shortly after Helen's first pregnancy, and for years, John had worked tirelessly to build a life for his family. But his career as a doctor wasn't just a job, it was a responsibility, a calling that consumed him. The long hours, the endless patience, the emergencies, each day was a test of his endurance. John had always tried to be a good father and husband, but the stress wore on him. By the time he came home each night, he was too tired to notice the changes in his family, the shifts in their behavior, and the fear that lingered just below the surface. To him, it was just another phase, something that would pass in time. Abby, the youngest of the family, was the one they all thought they could protect, the innocent heart of the Masons. But Abby wasn't as innocent as she appeared. She was a curious child, clever beyond her years, with a tendency to listen when others thought she wasn't paying attention. Abby knew more than anyone suspected. She'd found clues, little fragments of a story that her family tried to hide from her. A misplaced letter, a hushed conversation, a glimpse of her mother's haunted expression as she looked out the window. Abby didn't understand everything, but she understood enough to know that someone was watching them. She knew her mother was afraid, though she couldn't quite understand why. But there was one thing Abby understood all too well: she wasn't supposed to know about any of this. And so, she kept her secrets, telling no one, hiding her knowledge behind a mask of innocence. The Masons were a family bound by love, but love wasn't always enough to keep their secrets safe. Each of them held a piece of a puzzle they couldn't see. And as their individual secrets collided, the family's perfect image began to crack. They could feel it, the steady unraveling, the sense that something was lurking just beyond the edge of their understanding. And yet, even as the walls seemed to close in, the Masons clung to the illusion that they were safe. But they had no idea just how close danger truly was. Because while each of them struggled with their demons, someone else was watching, someone who knew every one of their secrets, someone who had waited, patiently, for the perfect moment to strike. Alone in the house, Helen's world had become a place of shadows and silence, a world where every creak and every murmur seemed amplified, carrying with it a sense of dread she couldn't escape. Eric is still missing. John has reported to security, and still no sign of him. That alone has increased Helen's fear. Who would be the next to be trapped? A question she constantly asked herself. At first, it was just small things. The sound of footsteps echoing down the empty hallway. The faint rustle of leaves outside her window when there was no breeze. Late at night, Helen would lie awake, listening to the sounds of her own home, yet feeling like a stranger within its walls. One night, the phone rang. It was nearly midnight, and the shrill sound shattered the silence like a scream. Helen hesitated before answering, her hand trembling as she lifted the receiver. But when she pressed it to her ear, silence. No voice, no words. Only the faint sound of breathing, just enough to make her blood run cold. Who could be watching? With each day, her fear grew. The strange calls, the eerie sounds, she began to feel like a prisoner in her own home. Every shadow, every whisper seemed to carry a hidden threat, a reminder that she was never truly alone. What would you do if you knew someone was always watching? But it wasn't just Helen who felt the eyes upon her. Abby, young as she was, had started to sense it too. She would look up from her homework, catching a glimpse of something in the corner of her eye, a movement, a shadow slipping just out of view. At first, she thought she was imagining things, but soon, even her innocence couldn't protect her from the truth. Seems the stalker wants to kidnap another person, she thought. As the days passed, Helen became more isolated. John was often at work, and Eric was still missing. She was left alone with her thoughts, with the steady drum of her own heartbeat pounding in her ears as she moved from room to room, feeling as though she were being watched at every turn. Each step felt heavier than the last, her mind filling with questions she dared not voice. Was it someone from her past, come back to haunt her? Was it all in her head? Or was someone, truly there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for her to let her guard down? The basement door. It had been locked just moments before, or had it? Helen couldn't remember. Her hands shook as she backed away, her mind spinning as she tried to make sense of the scene before her. Every instinct told her to run, to leave the house, but something held her there, rooted to the spot. Would you open the door? The days blurred together, each one filled with new signs, new warnings. Helen found strange notes tucked into her mailbox, notes that spoke of her past, notes that revealed things only she should have known. She tried to tell John, but he dismissed it as paranoia, a trick of the mind. Alone, isolated, Helen began to question her own sanity. And then, one night, she heard it, the whisper. Faint, barely audible, drifting through the house like a breeze. It called her name, a sound so chilling that it stopped her in her tracks. She stood frozen, her heart pounding as she strained to hear it again. Helen's hands clenched, her nails digging into her palms as she stood there, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She felt the walls closing in around her, the sense of being watched growing stronger, more intense. She wanted to scream, to call for help, but her voice caught in her throat. Helen backing against the wall, her eyes wide as she looks down the empty hallway. If you were in her place, what would you do? Days turned into nights, each one bringing new terrors, new signs that someone, somewhere, was always watching. Helen tried to keep calm, to keep her fears hidden from her family, but the strain was beginning to show. She would wake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, convinced that someone was in the room with her, only to find herself alone. She knew that something was coming, that the darkness around her wasn't just a trick of the mind. It was real as the beating of her own heart. And it was only a matter of time before the shadows would reveal themselves, before she'd come face to face with the truth she feared most. Who's behind the door? The Mason family seemed perfect on the outside, but as each day passed, it became harder to ignore the cracks that were beginning to show. Suspicion, fear, secrets, all simmering beneath the surface. Each family member had something to hide, something they didn't want the others to know. But we all know that secrets never stay buried forever. Could you trust your family if you knew one of them was hiding something? Imagine discovering that someone close to you had secrets they'd kept hidden from everyone, even you. Could you still look at them the same way? Could you trust them, knowing they were hiding something that could change everything? The Masons each had something to fear, something they couldn't tell the others. And for one of them, that fear was turning into something darker, a feeling of being watched, of being followed, a feeling that wouldn't let them rest. Have you ever felt like someone was following you? Share your story in the comments. Maybe you felt it yourself, that sense that you're not alone, that someone's watching from the shadows. Maybe you've glanced over your shoulder, catching a glimpse of a shadow that seemed to vanish just as quickly as it appeared. Tell us, have you ever felt that way? The Mason family didn't know who, or what, was watching them. But with each passing day, the feeling grew stronger, impossible to ignore. Who could it be? Was it someone from Helen's past, someone she'd tried to leave behind? Or was it connected to John, who'd been so consumed by his work that he'd lost sight of what was happening in his own home? Who do you think is watching the Masons? Maybe it was Eric, who seemed to be caught up in something none of them could understand. Or Abby, who was too young to fully grasp the fear surrounding her, yet sensed something no one else did. What do you think? Could someone inside the family be hiding the truth? Or maybe it's someone else entirely, someone who's been watching from a distance, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Do you have a theory? Who do you think is behind the strange events that haunt the Mason family? Tell us, if you were in their place, would you feel safe? But even as they tried to go about their routines, the signs of something darker lurking in the background grew impossible to ignore. They tried to hold on to their family life. For Helen, the message was a reminder of a time. She knew who had sent the letter, knew it was a ghost from her past, come back to haunt. But she kept silent, hoping that by ignoring it, the danger would pass. John brushed it off, telling himself it was nothing. But deep down, he knew there was something wrong. He could feel the tension growing at home, the sense that his family was slipping away from him, that there were things happening he couldn't control. But the tension had only begun to build. Each night, the feeling of being watched grew stronger, more intense. And soon, the Masons would come face to face with the one thing they feared most, the night when the shadows would finally reveal themselves. It was a night like any other, but beneath the surface, there was an electricity in the air, a tension that made each member of the family feel on edge, as though they were waiting for something they couldn't name. She knew she wasn't alone. She could feel it, the presence she had sensed for weeks now, finally making itself known. Her hand shook as she reached for the light switch, flicking it on only to find herself staring at an empty hallway. The light flickers and goes out, plunging her back into darkness. The sound of footsteps echoes in the distance, and Helen's breath catches as she realizes they're coming closer. She stumbles backward, her face a mask of terror as she tries to hide. John's mind raced, his every instinct telling him to leave, to get his family to safety. But he couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was happening, whatever was waiting for them, it was something he couldn't escape. He felt trapped, surrounded by an invisible force that held them all captive. And then, in the dead of night, the Mason home fell silent, as though the air itself had been sucked out of the room. A shadow moved through the hallway, quiet, deliberate. Helen held her breath, huddled in the darkness as she watched the figure approach, her mind racing as she realized who it was. Helen felt as though time had stopped, as though every breath, every heartbeat had slowed to a crawl. She knew that in this moment, everything could change, that one wrong move could be the end. And yet, she couldn't move, couldn't tear her gaze away from the figure standing so close she could almost feel its presence. The Masons believed they were safe, that the distant shadow haunting them was just a relic of Helen's past. But they were wrong. David had waited years, driven by a dark, obsessive love that no distance could weaken. And one night, that obsession finally turned deadly, leaving behind a trail of loss that would haunt the family forever. In the night, he approached the Mason home, his footsteps quiet yet deliberate. Helen and John were sound asleep, oblivious to the danger that crept closer with each passing second. David's fixation had finally consumed him. He believed he was reclaiming Helen, that she was still his, and that no one else deserved her love. Driven by this delusion, he moved through the house, stopping just outside Helen's bedroom, waiting, savoring the moment he'd dreamed of for so long. Helen woke to an unsettling silence. A feeling of dread spread through her as she saw David standing in the dim light, his gaze locked on her. She froze, terror filling her as she recognized the man she'd tried so desperately to escape. David was more than just an ex-lover, he was a man who had turned Helen's love into an obsession. She had fled from him years ago, determined to build a new life, one where he couldn't reach her. But David had followed her, watched her from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to step back into her life. Heart pounding, Helen tried to reason with him, begging him to leave her and her family alone. But David's obsession had left him beyond reason. As he stepped closer, his voice filled with confused affection, Helen's fear turned into a fierce determination. She had to protect her family, even if it meant facing David head-on. In a desperate attempt to escape, Helen grabbed a nearby vase, smashing it against David's head. But David barely flinched, his fixation too strong to be shaken by pain. Helen tried to run, but David caught her arm, his grip tightening as he pulled her back toward him. David's love for Helen had transformed into something monstrous. And in a final, tragic moment, his obsession overtook him completely. Helen's scream pierced the night, but it was too late. By the time John rushed into the room, he found her lifeless, a tragic victim of a past that wouldn't let go. Overcome with grief, John raised an alarm, his voice echoing through the house. Neighbors awoke, lights flickering on as John called for help. The police arrived swiftly, taking David into custody, ending his deadly obsession once and for all. The nightmare had ended, but the scars left behind would never fade. The man who claimed to love Helen had taken everything from her family, leaving them haunted by the memory of that tragic night. The Mason home was left empty, filled with an aching silence with memories of those they had lost. For John and Abby, it would never again be a place of safety, but a reminder of the violent obsession that stole their loved ones. For the Masons, the past was no longer just a memory, it was a dark force, a shadow that had destroyed their lives. This crime left them forever questioning how well we truly know those who enter our lives. Could something like this happen to anyone? Can we ever truly escape our past? Did you see that twist coming? Were you able to piece together the clues before the tragic ending? Did you see that coming? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We want to hear from you.